heard a story once about a young mother who gave birth to her first son during a time of genocide in her home country. And like any mother, she decided she would do almost everything in her power to try to protect and save the life of her young child. And so she came up with this plan where her young son actually got adopted by the family in power. And so she was able to save his life, and this young boy grew up with so much incredible privilege and power. But the older he got, the more he started to have questions, like you and I do sometimes, questions about his identity, of who was he and why did he look different from the family around him. And so this led him on a journey or a quest of identity, and it took some dark and twisty turns until eventually he ended up murdering somebody. And so he didn't know what to do, and so he decided to flee from the scene of the crime and was in hiding so that he wasn't found out. And yet when he was in hiding, that God appeared to him and called him to be one of the greatest prophets and preachers and leaders the world had ever seen. That God decided to work through a murderer to save countless of people's lives. And you and I know his name to be Moses. Time and time again, God works through messed up people like you and me. God chooses to work through Moses, who was a murderer, through King David, who had a thing for other people's wives, for Bathsheba and for Rahab, who was a prostitute, and for Paul, who wanted to kill Christians. God chooses to work through messed up people, not in spite of their mistakes, but I think sometimes because of them. That God is a God of second chances and can witness through the broken areas of our lives. So we're in the middle of this flawed and faithful sermon series where the good news is that our mistakes don't disqualify us from following Jesus, that God works through even our mistakes. So today we're going to look at one of the darkest moments in Peter's life when he messed up when it mattered the most. So if you want to follow along, we're going to be in Matthew 26, beginning in verse 31. But just let me set the stage of what's going on. So Peter and the other disciples are having the Passover dinner with Jesus, something they celebrated every year. But on this particular year, when they were celebrating Passover, Jesus, as he was leading them through the liturgy and the prayers, he kept referring to himself and alluding to his own death. And Peter wasn't really having all this death talk. He was like, Jesus, what's going on? Like, I don't really understand what's going on here. And so after the dinner together, Jesus took the remaining disciples, since Judas had already left, and they went to the Garden of Gethsemane at the base of the Mount of Olives. And this is what Jesus says in Matthew 26, beginning in verse 31. Then Jesus said to them, "You will all become deserters because of me this night. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go ahead of you to Galilee." Peter said to Jesus, "Though all become deserters because of you, I will never desert you." Jesus said to him, "Truly I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter said to Jesus, "Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you." And so said all the other disciples. Jesus said that all the disciples would desert him that night. But Peter said, "No, Jesus, even if I have to die, I will not desert you." And all the other disciples are like, yeah, like what he said, "We're with you, Jesus." And so some of you know the story, right? They're in the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus has one request: for the disciples to stay awake and pray. But they can't do that, and they keep falling asleep. Although eventually they are all awakened from their slumber because a mob of people enter the Garden of Gethsemane. And it's made up mostly of religious rulers, and some other people got caught up in the mob psychology, and they have torches and clubs and swords, and they are coming for Jesus. And that mob is led by one guy named Judas. And so Judas comes up and kisses Jesus to betray his friend, his teacher, his master with a kiss. And Peter is furious. What is Judas doing? Who does he think he is? They can't just arrest Jesus like this. So Peter grabs a sword and chops off somebody's ear. Now we know Peter doesn't really think often before he acts. And so if you're going to chop off somebody's ear, don't chop off the ear of the servant of the high priest, Peter. Come on, that was not the brightest move. But anyway, he chops off the servant's ear, and Jesus is like, whoa, wait. Heals the guy's ear and is like, Peter, violence is not the answer here. But Peter feels hopeless. He doesn't know what to do. He wants to help and intervene, but he has to watch Jesus be arrested, and he decides to follow the mob at a distance to see where they're going to take Jesus. So they take Jesus to the high priest's house. And while Jesus is on trial inside the house, Peter has his own trial going on outside the house. Peter was actually courageous enough to enter the courtyard where members of the mob that were just in the garden were probably also there, warming their hands at the fire. And so Peter's bold enough to be there to see what's going on with Jesus, and he's warming his hands, and a young servant girl comes up and says, "Don't you know Jesus? Weren't you with Jesus?" And Peter dismisses it, not knowing what she's talking about. And then Peter goes over from the fire back to the gate to kind of hide in the shadows. And this time a woman comes up to him and says, "Weren't you with Jesus?" And Peter's like, no, I don't even know Jesus. I don't know what you're talking about. And then an hour later, this time a man who was actually the relative of the guy Peter chopped off his ear, who was in the garden, comes up to Peter and says, "Weren't you in the garden with Jesus?" And Peter curses and swears that he doesn't even know Jesus. And then the rooster crows 1, 2, 3 times. And Peter, the rock, is crushed. And he runs out of that courtyard weeping uncontrollably, realizing that he just denied Jesus, the man he said hours before he would never desert, that he messed up when it mattered the most, and Peter was crushed. And you and I don't know all of Peter's story. We don't know if maybe he had an extreme fear of death. Maybe he lost a parent at a young age. Maybe he had a near-death experience on the Sea of Galilee. We don't know what caused Peter to deny Jesus, but what we do know is that we can relate. Because you and I, we deny Jesus every single day by our words and our actions, or by our lack of words and our actions, that we all mess up just like Peter every single day. There's this famous verse in Romans 3:23 that says, all have sinned. All of us have messed up and fallen short of the glory of God, that we fall short of the life that God desires for us every single day. You see, you and I know there's this tension in each one of us, that we are good and created in the image of God. That's what Genesis tells us. But we are also fallen and messed up, broken people. That we have this tension between good and evil inside of us, that the good we want to do, we sometimes don't do it, and the bad we don't want to do, we sometimes keep on doing it. And so we have this tension of being good and messed up all at the same time. And that is why all of us are in desperate need of being rescued. That we need to be saved, that we need to be liberated and set free and redeemed. And so that is what Easter and the cross is all about. That is why God sent Jesus to set us free. And I just want to correct something this morning, because sometimes we have this messed up thought that we think that God was so angry at humanity and so angry at us for the mess we created, for the brokenness of our own lives, that God is so angry at humanity that God had to take God's anger out on somebody, and so God chose to take its anger out on Jesus. But that is not true. Love, not anger, is what led Jesus to the cross. Love, not anger, is what led Jesus to the cross. It is God's nature to give and to forgive. And so that is what led to the cross. God knew the only way that God could defeat the power of evil in the world was to absorb and transform transform it. That's what happened on the cross. Just like good leaders absorb negativity and don't transmit it, that's what Jesus was doing on the cross. I like to say you can't heal what you don't feel. And so God was going to feel the power of evil so that he could feel it and heal it and transform it to set us free. So Jesus on the cross feels the weight of the power of evil and sin and brokenness in the world, and that's enough to crush anybody. And so under the weight of the power of evil, Jesus died. And if that was the end of the story, we wouldn't even really be here to talk about it. But thank goodness God raised Jesus back to life and proved that life and love and hope would always have the final victory. And that you and I are in need of rescuing. But thanks be to God, because of the power of Jesus, we can be set free. The beautiful thing about our journey with Jesus is that it's a partnership. It's a cooperation where we say yes to the power of God's Spirit and grace in our lives. And that's one of the reasons why spiritual practices like prayer or scripture reading or worship or service are so important. But there's another spiritual practice that, to be honest, we don't often talk a lot about. If any of you grew up in the Catholic tradition, you're probably more familiar with this than some of the rest of us. But there's an ancient spiritual practice of confession. And the power of confession is that it's able to help set us free. And so confession looks like first just being honest with God and yourself about how you mess up in your life. It's saying, God, I acted in anger at my teenager this week. Or God, I said a terrible thing about my spouse this week. Or God, I struggle with pride or with jealousy or greed or making you a priority in my life. It's being honest with God about how we mess up. And then the second step is expressing sorrow. And by that, I don't mean that we are always weeping uncontrollably like happened in Peter's story. And sometimes that happens to us. Sometimes we hit rock bottom and that's where we're at. But sometimes it's just saying, I'm sorry. God, I'm sorry for breaking your heart. God, I'm sorry for breaking that other person's heart. I'm sorry for breaking my own heart. And it's saying that we're sorry. And then the third step is a desire and a commitment to turn away from and to avoid sin in our life. The Bible talks about this idea of repentance, where you're walking one way that's maybe not a helpful way in your life and it's causing harm to you and others, and then you turn around to head toward the life that God desires for you. And that is possible because of God's Spirit and grace in our lives.